The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Riverside Concert Hall, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Outside, the autumn leaves danced in the crisp October breeze, but inside, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Today was the final round of the state music competition, and everyone who was anyone in the classical music world had gathered to witness it. Backstage, 19-year-old Daniel sat quietly on a worn leather chair, his white cane resting against his knee. He could hear the muffled sounds of the previous contestant finishing their piece. The audience applauded politely but not enthusiastically. Daniel's fingers moved slightly as if playing an invisible piano on his lap. He had been doing this since he was 4 years old, whenever he felt nervous or excited. Music was the language he spoke most fluently, the one thing in his life that had never failed him. His mother, Patricia, sat beside him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. After 19 years of being his biggest supporter, his fiercest advocate, and sometimes his only believer, she knew when words would help and when silence was better. This was a silence moment. Daniel needed to focus, to center himself, to find that quiet place inside where the music lived. The stage manager, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a clipboard permanently attached to her hand, approached them. "Daniel, you're up next, sweetheart. Are you ready?" Daniel stood, reaching for his cane with practiced ease. "Ready as I'll ever be," he said, offering a small smile that didn't quite hide his nervousness. Patricia squeezed his hand once firmly. It was their signal, the one they had shared before every performance, every audition, every moment that mattered. One squeeze meant, "I believe in you. I've always believed in you. Now go show them what you can do." Daniel followed the stage manager through the wings, his cane tapping softly against the floor. He had memorized this route during the morning rehearsal, counting his steps, noting the slight incline as they approached the stage. 12 steps forward, turn left, 8 more steps, then the stage would open before him. Not that he would see it, of course, but he could feel it. The energy of a space, the way sound traveled through it, the subtle shift in air temperature. These were the things Daniel saw. As he stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the audience. It wasn't the respectful silence that greets any performer. It was something else. Something uncomfortable. Daniel could feel hundreds of eyes on him, could sense the shift in the room as people registered his white cane, his slightly unfocused gaze, the careful way he moved across the stage. In the third row, Judge Robert Harrison sat with his arms crossed over his chest. At 57 years old, Harrison had built a reputation as one of the most respected and most feared judges in classical music circles. He had trained at Juilliard, performed in concert halls across Europe, and taught at prestigious conservatories. He had also developed a reputation for being brutally honest, sometimes to the point of cruelty. He believed in maintaining standards, in protecting the integrity of classical music, in not letting sentimentality cloud judgment. And right now, watching this young blind man make his way to the piano, Harrison felt a familiar irritation rising in his chest. He had seen this before. Well-meaning parents who pushed their disabled children into competitions they weren't ready for. Audiences who gave standing ovations not for excellence but for effort. The lowering of standards in the name of inclusivity. It bothered him. Music, real music, demanded perfection. It demanded the ability to read complex scores, to watch a conductor, to collaborate visually with other musicians. "This ought to be interesting," Harrison muttered to himself, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge sitting next to him, Maria Rodriguez, a violin professor with decades of experience, shot him a warning look. "Robert," she said quietly, "give him a chance." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "I'm not being unreasonable. I'm being realistic. How can he possibly compete at this level? He can't even see the piano." On stage, Daniel reached the grand piano. It was a Steinway Model D, 9 feet of perfectly crafted instrument with 88 keys that could produce sounds ranging from thunderous to whisper soft. Daniel's fingers brushed against its smooth surface, and he felt a familiar thrill run through him. This was it. This was the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. He carefully felt for the bench, positioning it exactly where he needed it. Then he sat down, adjusting his posture, his feet finding the pedals, his hands hovering just above the keys. For a moment, he simply sat there, breathing, centering himself. In his mind, he could see the music. Not with his eyes, of course, but in a different way, a deeper way. He could see the architecture of the piece he was about to play, could feel its emotional landscape, could sense where every note needed to fall. The audience waited. Some people leaned forward in anticipation. Others exchanged skeptical glances. Judge Harrison tapped his pen impatiently against his scoring sheet. Patricia, watching from the wings, pressed her hands together. She remembered the first time Daniel had touched a piano. He had been only 3 years old, and they had been visiting a friend's house. While the adults talked in the kitchen, Daniel had wandered into the living room and found the old upright piano against the wall. Within minutes, he was picking out a simple melody he had heard on the radio. No lessons, no instruction. Just an inexplicable, natural connection between his fingers and the keys. The doctors had told her when Daniel was born that his blindness would limit him. Teachers had told her he should focus on realistic career goals. Music instructors had refused to take him as a student, saying they didn't have the specialized training to teach a blind child. But Patricia had fought for him, had driven 3 hours each way to find a teacher who would give him a chance, had sat through countless practice sessions, had believed in him even when the rest of the world didn't. Now, watching her son on that stage, she felt her heart beating so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Daniel took one more deep breath. His fingers settled onto the keys. The hall fell completely silent. Even Judge Harrison stopped tapping his pen. And then, in a voice that was quiet but clear, Daniel spoke. "I'll be performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor," he said. "This piece has always meant a lot to me. Rachmaninoff wrote it after a period of deep depression, when he thought he might never compose again. It's about finding your voice when the world has made you doubt it. It's about proving people wrong. It's about remembering that the most important music isn't played for anyone else. It's played for yourself." He didn't wait for a response. His hands descended onto the keys, and the first notes filled the hall. What happened next would change everything. The first notes that came from Daniel's fingers weren't timid or hesitant. They were powerful, commanding, filled with a confidence that seemed to contradict everything about his situation. The opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 began with deep, resonant chords that seemed to shake the very foundation of the concert hall. Judge Harrison's pen froze mid-air. His eyebrows, which had been raised in skeptical anticipation, suddenly drew together in concentration. This wasn't what he had expected. Not at all. The piece Daniel had chosen was notorious among pianists. Rachmaninoff had famously large hands and wrote music that reflected that advantage. The concerto demanded enormous technical skill, with passages that required the pianist's hands to stretch across vast distances on the keyboard, sometimes playing 10 or 11 keys at once. It was the kind of piece that made even seasoned professionals nervous. Many considered it one of the most difficult works in the entire piano repertoire. And here was this blind teenager, barely out of high school, attacking it with a ferocity and precision that seemed impossible. Daniel's left hand thundered through the lower registers, while his right hand danced across the higher notes, creating a conversation between darkness and light, between despair and hope. His body swayed slightly with the music, not in an exaggerated or performative way, but as if he and the piano had become a single entity, breathing together, moving together. In the audience, an elderly woman leaned toward her husband. "Did you see that passage?" she whispered urgently. "My granddaughter has been working on this piece for 2 years and still can't nail those transitions. He just played them perfectly." Her husband nodded, unable to take his eyes off the stage. "It's like he knows where every key is without thinking about it." That was exactly it. While other pianists had to constantly check their hand positions, had to glance down at the keys to ensure accuracy, Daniel had no such option. He had spent 15 years building a map of the keyboard in his mind, so detailed, so precise, that his fingers could find any note without hesitation. The piano wasn't something he played. It was something he lived inside of. Judge Harrison shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of how wrong his initial assessment had been. He glanced at his scoring sheet, at the harsh notes he had already prepared to write. Lack of visual awareness, probable timing issues, limited dynamic range due to technical constraints. He had been ready to be kind but firm, to give the boy points for effort while ultimately scoring him low on execution. But execution wasn't the problem. If anything, Daniel's execution was flawless. The music continued to build, moving into the concerto's more lyrical second section. Here the piece transformed from powerful and dramatic to achingly beautiful. It was the part where many pianists struggled not with technique but with emotion. The notes themselves weren't difficult, but making them sing, making them speak to the human heart, that was the challenge. Daniel played each phrase as if he were telling a story. His fingers caressed the keys rather than striking them, drawing out a sound so pure and sweet that several people in the audience found tears forming in their eyes. This wasn't just music. This was something deeper. This was the sound of someone who had lived in darkness their entire life, but had somehow found light in the language of melody and harmony. Patricia, still watching from the wings, covered her mouth with her hand. She had heard her son practice this piece hundreds of times. She had sat in their small living room listening to him work through each section, sometimes playing a single measure over and over until he got it exactly right. But hearing it here in this magnificent hall, with perfect acoustics and a world-class piano, was different. Here she could hear what Daniel had been trying to achieve all along. Here, his vision for the piece came fully to life. She remembered a conversation they had had just last week. Daniel had been frustrated, worried that he wouldn't be good enough, that the judges would dismiss him before he even played a note. "Mom," he had said, "what if they're right? What if I am trying to do something that's just not realistic for someone like me?" Patricia had taken his hands in hers. "Daniel, do you know why you're better than most of the people you're competing against?" He had shaken his head. "Because you don't play with your eyes. You play with your heart. You play with every part of yourself. Other pianists see the notes on a page and translate them to their fingers. You feel the music in your soul and let it flow out through your hands. That's not a disadvantage. That's a gift." Now, watching him prove her words true, she felt a fierce pride that made her chest ache. On stage, Daniel moved into the concerto's most technically demanding section. His hands flew across the keyboard in a blur of motion, playing rapid passages that required absolute precision. One wrong note, one misplaced finger, and the entire thing would collapse. But Daniel didn't falter. His muscle memory, honed through countless hours of practice, guided his fingers exactly where they needed to be. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his critical eye now searching not for flaws but trying to understand how this was possible. He had taught piano for 30 years. He had worked with prodigies, with students who seemed to have music encoded in their DNA. But he had never seen anything quite like this. The way Daniel moved, the way he anticipated each phrase, the way his entire being seemed to merge with the instrument, it was extraordinary. Maria Rodriguez, the judge sitting beside him, leaned over and whispered,
"Still think this is going to be interesting, Robert?"
Harrison had the grace to look embarrassed. "I was wrong," he admitted quietly. "Completely wrong." But even as he said it, he knew it was more than that. He hadn't just been wrong about Daniel's ability to play the piano. He had been wrong about what was possible, about what true musical genius looked like, about the assumptions he had been making for his entire career. The music continued to soar, filling every corner of the vast hall. People who had come expecting a pleasant afternoon of student performances were getting something entirely different. They were witnessing the kind of moment that happens maybe once in a lifetime, when someone with extraordinary talent, extraordinary dedication, and extraordinary courage steps onto a stage and reminds everyone why music matters. In the back row, a young music student who had been half-heartedly scrolling through her phone put it away and sat up straight. She had been considering quitting piano, feeling like she would never be good enough to make it as a professional musician. But watching Daniel, watching someone overcome obstacles she couldn't even imagine, made her want to try harder. That was the thing about truly great performances. They didn't just entertain. They inspired. They changed people. They made you want to be better. Daniel's hands moved through another complex passage, his fingers crossing over each other in movements so fast they were almost impossible to follow. The music built toward its first climax, layer upon layer of sound, creating a wall of emotion that washed over the audience like a wave. And then, just as suddenly, it softened. The storm passed, and what remained was something delicate and beautiful. A quiet moment of reflection before the final movement would begin. Daniel paused for just a breath, his hands hovering over the keys. In that moment of silence, every person in the hall held their breath, waiting for what would come next. The third movement of the concerto exploded into life with a rush of notes that cascaded like a waterfall. Daniel's fingers moved with impossible speed, playing scales and arpeggios that climbed up and down the keyboard in dizzying patterns. This was the section where most pianists showed signs of fatigue, where the physical demands of the piece finally caught up with them. But Daniel seemed to be drawing energy from somewhere deep within, playing with even more intensity than before. What the audience couldn't see, what they couldn't possibly know, was the journey that had brought Daniel to this moment. They didn't know about the countless teachers who had rejected him. They didn't know about the music schools that had told his mother, politely but firmly, that they weren't equipped to handle a student with special needs. They didn't know about the countless auditions where he had been dismissed before he even finished playing. But Daniel knew. And every rejection, every closed door, every person who had told him his dreams were unrealistic, all of it fueled the fire in his performance now. This wasn't just about playing the right notes. This was about proving something, not just to the judges or the audience, but to himself, that he belonged here, that his blindness wasn't a limitation, but simply another way of experiencing the world. His hands crossed over each other in complex patterns, the right hand playing in the bass register while the left hand reached up to the treble. It was a passage that required absolute spatial awareness, where even the slightest miscalculation would result in his hands colliding or missing notes entirely. But Daniel navigated it as easily as someone walking through their own home in the dark, because for him the piano wasn't something he had to see. It was something he felt, something he understood on a level that went beyond sight. In the front row, an older gentleman who had been a concert pianist in his youth turned to his wife with wonder in his eyes. "He's doing something I never could," he whispered. "He's playing without any fear at all. No hesitation, no second guessing. Just pure music." His wife squeezed his hand, her own eyes wet with tears. "It's beautiful," she managed to say. It was more than beautiful. It was transcendent. It was the kind of performance that reminded people why they had fallen in love with music in the first place. In a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving, where success seemed to require cutting corners and playing it safe, here was someone who had taken the hardest possible path and was succeeding not despite his challenges, but in some inexplicable way because of them. Judge Harrison sat perfectly still, his scoring sheet forgotten. He was a man who prided himself on objectivity, on being able to separate emotion from technical assessment. But right now he couldn't tell where technique ended and artistry began. Daniel's playing was so complete, so fully realized, that trying to break it down into categories felt almost insulting to what was happening on that stage. Harrison thought about his own career, about the countless hours he had spent in practice rooms and concert halls. He had been good, very good in fact, good enough to perform in prestigious venues, good enough to teach at elite conservatories. But watching Daniel, he realized there was a difference between being technically proficient and being truly inspired, and he couldn't remember the last time he had played with the kind of abandon, the kind of total commitment that this young man was demonstrating right now. The music shifted again, moving into a passage that was more contemplative, more introspective, where before the notes had been rushing and urgent, now they flowed like a gentle stream. Daniel's touch on the keys became softer, more delicate. He was painting with sound, creating colors and textures that seemed to hang in the air of the concert hall. This was where Rachmaninoff's genius truly showed itself. The piece wasn't just technically difficult, it was emotionally exhausting. It took the performer and the listener on a complete journey, from darkness to light, from despair to triumph, from chaos to peace, and it required the pianist to inhabit every one of those emotional states fully and convincingly. Daniel played as if he had lived every note. His face reflected the changing moods of the music, intense concentration during the complex passages, peaceful serenity during the gentle moments, fierce determination during the powerful sections. He wasn't performing the piece. He was living it in real time, discovering it anew even though he had played it hundreds of times before. Patricia watched from the wings, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She remembered the day Daniel had first told her he wanted to be a professional pianist. He had been 12 years old, and they had just attended a concert at the local university. On the drive home, he had been unusually quiet. Finally, he had spoken. "Mom, I know it's probably impossible. I know people like me aren't supposed to do things like this. but I want to be a concert pianist. Not because I want to prove anything to anyone, but because when I play, I feel like I can see. Does that make sense? Patricia had pulled the car over, unable to drive through her tears. It makes perfect sense, sweetheart. And you know what? You're going to do it. I don't care how many people tell us it's impossible. We're going to make it happen. That promise had led them on a 7-year journey. 7 years of driving hundreds of miles to find teachers who were willing to work with Daniel. 7 years of financial struggle as they invested in the best instruction, the best instruments, the best opportunities they could afford. 7 years of watching her son face rejection after rejection, disappointment after disappointment, but never once giving up. And now watching him on this stage, performing at a level that most pianists could only dream of. Patricia knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. Every mile driven, every penny spent, every tear shed, all of it had led to this moment. The concerto was building toward its grand finale now. The tempo increased, the dynamics grew louder, and the technical demands reached their peak. Daniel's entire body was engaged in the performance, swaying with the rhythm, leaning into the powerful chords, pulling back during the softer moments. Sweat glistened on his forehead, but his concentration never wavered. Around the hall, people had given up any pretense of casual listening. Everyone was leaning forward, completely absorbed in what they were witnessing. Some had their mouths open in amazement. Others had tears streaming down their faces. A few were gripping the arms of their seats so tightly their knuckles had turned white. This was what great art was supposed to do. It was supposed to reach inside you and touch something you didn't even know was there. It was supposed to make you feel things you couldn't put into words. It was supposed to remind you that life, despite all its hardships and disappointments, could still contain moments of transcendent beauty. Judge Harrison found himself thinking about something his own teacher had told him decades ago. The difference between a good musician and a great one, the old man had said, isn't in the fingers. It's in the heart. A good musician plays the notes on the page. A great musician plays the silence between the notes, the emotions behind the notes, the story the composer was trying to tell. Daniel wasn't just a great musician, he was something else entirely. He was a force of nature, a reminder of what human beings were capable of when they refused to accept the limitations that others placed on them. The final measures approached. Daniel's hands flew across the keyboard one last time, building to the concerto's triumphant conclusion. The entire hall seemed to vibrate with the power of the sound, with the sheer energy that Daniel was channeling through his fingers into the piano and out into the world. And then, with a final powerful chord, it was over. For 3 full seconds after the final chord faded into silence, nobody moved. The concert hall was so quiet you could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning system. Daniel sat perfectly still at the piano, his hands resting on the keys, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. He looked exhausted but peaceful, like someone who had just completed a long and difficult journey. Then someone in the back row stood up. Then another person. Then another. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, and the applause that erupted was unlike anything the Riverside Concert Hall had heard in years. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the kind of clapping you do because it's expected. This was thunderous, overwhelming, the kind of applause that shakes the walls and makes your ears ring. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering, shouting. Some were crying openly. The elderly pianist in the front row had both hands pressed to his face, tears streaming between his fingers. The young music student in the back row was applauding so hard her hands hurt, a huge grin on her face. All around the hall, people were turning to each other with expressions of wonder and disbelief, as if they couldn't quite process what they had just witnessed. Daniel stood slowly from the piano bench, reaching for his white cane. He turned in the direction of the applause and offered a small, humble bow. The gesture somehow made the applause even louder. This young man, who had just delivered a performance that many would remember for the rest of their lives, seemed almost shy about accepting the recognition. Patricia rushed onto the stage, tears streaming down her face. She wrapped her son in a tight hug, and for a moment they just stood there together, mother and son, while hundreds of people continued to celebrate around them. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. Judge Harrison remained seated while everyone around him stood and applauded. Not because he wasn't moved, His own eyes were wet with tears he was too proud to fully acknowledge, but because he was trying to process what had just happened. In his 3 decades of judging competitions, he had developed a reputation for being tough but fair. He had seen talented students. He had seen dedicated students. He had even seen what most people would call prodigies. But this was different. This was the kind of performance that didn't just demonstrate skill. It demonstrated something deeper, something that couldn't be taught or learned through practice alone. It was the kind of performance that made you question everything you thought you knew about music, about talent, about what was possible. And he had almost dismissed it. He had almost written this young man off before he had played a single note. The shame of that realization hit Harrison like a physical weight. Maria Rodriguez, the judge sitting beside him, finally spoke. "Robert, you need to stand up." Her voice was gentle but firm. Harrison looked at her and she could see the conflict in his eyes. "I don't deserve to applaud," he said quietly. "Not after what I said." Maria shook her head. "That's exactly why you need to stand up. Not for yourself, for him, because he just taught all of us something important." Harrison slowly rose to his feet and began to clap. His hands felt heavy, each clap a small acknowledgement of his own prejudice, his own narrow-mindedness. But as he continued to applaud, something began to shift inside him. The shame didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else, a determination to do better, to be better. The applause continued for nearly 5 minutes. Daniel stood on stage, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but also visibly moved by the response. Finally, the stage manager signaled that they needed to continue with the competition. There were still 3 more performers scheduled after Daniel. As Daniel made his way off the stage, guided by his mother, several audience members reached out to shake his hand or offer words of congratulation. He accepted each gesture with grace, thanking people quietly, his face flushed with emotion and exhaustion. Backstage, the other competitors stood in stunned silence. They had all heard the performance, of course. The sound had carried through the entire building. 2 of them looked devastated, knowing that whatever they played now would feel like an afterthought. But one young woman, a violinist named Claire, who was scheduled to perform next, approached Daniel with a warm smile. "That was incredible," she said simply. "Thank you for that. You just reminded me why I love music." Daniel smiled back. "Thank you. That means a lot. And good luck out there. I'm sure you'll be amazing." Claire paused, then laughed softly. "Honestly, I'm terrified to follow that. But you know what? I'm also inspired. If you can play like that with everything you've had to overcome, then I have no excuse for not giving it everything I've got." That was the ripple effect of what Daniel had done. It wasn't just about his own performance. It was about showing everyone else what was possible when you refused to let obstacles define you. In the judges' area, Harrison was having a quiet conversation with the other 2 judges. "We need to talk about the scoring," he said. "I need to explain something." The 3rd judge, an older man named Gregory who taught composition at the State University, held up his hand. "Robert, we all heard what you said before the performance, and we all just saw you realize how wrong you were. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Harrison took a deep breath. "I want to make a public statement. After the scores are announced, I need to apologize. Not just to him, but to everyone. Because if I could be that wrong about this, I'm probably wrong about other things too." Maria nodded approvingly. "That takes courage, Robert. Real courage." The competition continued. The 3 remaining performers did their best, and they were good. Legitimately talented musicians who deserved recognition. But everyone in the hall knew what the outcome would be. There was simply no comparison. When all the performances were finished, the judges retired to deliberate. It took them less than 15 minutes to reach a unanimous decision. Daniel had scored higher than anyone had ever scored in the 30-year history of the state music competition. It wasn't even close. As the audience filed back into the hall for the award ceremony, the buzz of conversation was electric. People were already pulling out their phones, texting friends and family about what they had witnessed. Some were searching online to see if Daniel had any recordings available. Others were talking about how they needed to tell everyone they knew about this performance. The 3 finalists were called to the stage. Daniel stood between the 2 other performers, his white cane at his side, looking both excited and nervous. The head of the competition, A distinguished woman in her 60s named Dr. Helen Wright stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "In all my years of organizing this competition, I have never been more proud to announce a winner. This year's state music competition first place, with a unanimous decision from our judges, goes to Daniel Peterson." The applause was immediate and deafening. Daniel's face broke into a huge smile as Dr. Wright placed the medal around his neck and handed him the trophy. He held it carefully, his fingers exploring its shape, learning it the way he learned everything, through touch. But everyone in the hall knew that Daniel hadn't just won a competition. He had done something far more important. He had changed hearts and minds. He had challenged assumptions. He had reminded everyone present that genius doesn't look the same for everyone, and that the most extraordinary gifts often come in the most unexpected packages, and the most important moment was still to come. As the applause for Daniel's victory began to die down, Judge Harrison stood up from his seat. His movements were slow, deliberate, like someone preparing to do something difficult but necessary. The other judges looked at him with understanding and encouragement. Maria gave him a small nod that said, "You can do this." Harrison walked toward the stage, and Dr. Wright, sensing something important was about to happen, stepped aside and handed him the microphone. The hall grew quiet again, everyone curious about what one of the competition's most respected judges wanted to say. Harrison looked out at the audience, then turned to face Daniel, who stood on stage still holding his trophy. For a long moment, the judge seemed to struggle with his words. His hands gripped the microphone tightly, and those close enough could see that they were trembling slightly. "Daniel," he finally began, his voice rougher than usual. "Everyone here. I need to say something, and I need to say it publicly because my mistake was made publicly." The audience was completely silent now. Even the people who had been whispering to each other stopped and turned their full attention to the stage. "Before Daniel performed today," Harrison continued, his voice gaining strength, "I made a comment. Actually, I made several comments. I said that this was going to be interesting, but I didn't mean it as a compliment. I looked at this young man walking to the piano with his white cane, and I made a judgment. I decided before he had played a single note that he couldn't possibly compete at this level. I said, and I quote myself because I need to own these words, 'He can't even see the piano.'" A few people in the audience gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Daniel stood very still, his face unreadable. Harrison's voice cracked slightly. "I've been judging music competitions for 30 years. I've taught at some of the finest conservatories in the country. I've performed in concert halls around the world. And I thought all of that experience, all of that knowledge gave me the right to make assumptions about what was possible and what wasn't." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But what I witnessed today taught me something I should have learned a long time ago. True artistry has nothing to do with what we can see. It has everything to do with what we can feel, what we can express, what we can share with others through our music." Harrison turned to face Daniel directly now. "Daniel, you didn't just play Rachmaninoff's piano concerto today. You revealed its soul. You showed everyone in this hall what the piece was meant to be, and you did it with a level of technical precision and emotional depth that I, frankly, have rarely witnessed in my entire career." The judge's voice grew softer, more personal. "I owe you an apology, not just for my comments, but for the attitude behind them, for thinking that there was only one way to be a musician, for believing that limitations were limitations instead of just different ways of experiencing and creating art." He looked back out at the audience. "But I also owe all of you an apology, because if I could be that wrong about Daniel, how many other talented people have I dismissed over the years? How many students have I discouraged because they didn't fit my narrow definition of what a musician should be? How many opportunities for greatness have been lost because people like me were too rigid, too set in our ways, to see potential that didn't look the way we expected?" Several people in the audience were crying now. The elderly pianist in the front row was nodding vigorously, as if Harrison was finally saying something he had been waiting years to hear. "Daniel," Harrison said, turning back to the young man, "you didn't just win a competition today. You changed something. Maybe you changed a lot of things. You certainly changed me, and I want to thank you for that, for having the courage to step onto this stage, for refusing to accept other people's limitations, for showing all of us what's possible when talent, dedication, and heart come together. Harrison's voice grew stronger now, more certain. I'm going to do better. I'm going to make sure that the institutions I'm part of do better. I'm going to spend the rest of my career making sure that students like you don't face the barriers that you've had to overcome. That's not charity. That's not political correctness. That's just recognizing that genius comes in many forms. And our job as educators and judges is to nurture it wherever we find it, not to put it in a box that makes us comfortable. He extended his hand toward Daniel. I hope you can forgive an old fool who thought he knew everything. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, a genuine warm smile that lit up his entire face. He reached out, not quite in the right direction at first, but Harrison stepped forward and took his hand, shaking it firmly. Thank you, Daniel said simply. That took a lot of courage to say all of that. And honestly, I forgive you. I've heard worse. I've faced bigger obstacles. But what matters is that Harry listened. You really listened to the music. That's all any musician can ask for. The audience erupted in applause again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just celebrating Daniel's talent. It was celebrating something bigger. A moment of genuine human growth. A willingness to admit being wrong and commit to doing better. Patricia, watching from the side of the stage, felt tears streaming down her face for what felt like the 100th time that day. But these were different tears. These were tears of vindication. All those years of fighting for her son, of advocating for him, of refusing to accept the word no, it had all been leading to this moment. After the ceremony ended, something unexpected happened. Instead of everyone filing out of the hall immediately, people lingered. They wanted to talk about what they had witnessed. Groups formed throughout the hall, strangers discussing the performance, the apology, what it all meant. The young music student who had been considering quitting approached Daniel as he was preparing to leave. Can I ask you something? She said nervously. Of course, Daniel replied. How do you keep going when people tell you that you can't do something? I mean, you must have heard that a lot. Daniel thought for a moment. I did hear it a lot. And honestly, some days it was really hard. Some days I wanted to quit. But I realized something. The people who were telling me I couldn't do it didn't know what was inside me. They didn't know how much I loved music. They didn't know how hard I was willing to work. So I decided that I was going to prove them wrong, not to be spiteful or to show off, but because I deserved the chance to try. The student nodded, something shifting in her expression. Thank you. I think I needed to hear that. Over the next few weeks, the video of Daniel's performance went viral online. Millions of people watched it, shared it, commented on it. But more importantly, conversations started happening. Music schools began reviewing their admission policies. Competition organizers started thinking about accessibility. Teachers began questioning their own assumptions about what their students could achieve. Judge Harrison kept his promise. He spent the following months working with disability advocacy groups, helping to create new guidelines for music education programs. He gave talks at conferences about unconscious bias in the arts. He became, in his own words, the student instead of the teacher for once. As for Daniel, he received scholarship offers from prestigious music conservatories across the country. He was invited to perform at venues that had once seemed completely out of reach. But what mattered most to him wasn't the fame or the opportunities. It was knowing that somewhere out there, another kid who couldn't see or couldn't hear or couldn't walk, or faced any of 1,000 different challenges, might see his story and think, if he can do it, maybe I can too. Because that was what the day at Riverside Concert Hall had really been about. Not just one performance, no matter how brilliant, but a reminder that human potential cannot be measured by conventional standards. That greatness often comes from unexpected places, and that sometimes the most profound thing we can do is admit we were wrong, learn from it, and help make sure the next generation doesn't face the same barriers. Daniel never forgot Judge Harrison's apology. Years later, when he was performing in concert halls around the world, he would sometimes tell the story, not to embarrass Harrison, but to celebrate him, because it takes talent to play the piano, but it takes real courage to change your mind.